This 1901 portrait of friends looked ordinary until you. See the mark on the girl's wrist? Dr. Emma Brennan had spent 3 months cataloging the Immigrant Experience collection at the New York Historical Society. The archive contained thousands of photographs documenting the lives of immigrants who had arrived through Ellis Island between 1890 and 1920. Most images were predictable. Families on ship decks, workers in factories, crowded tenement streets. Then she found the photograph that would change everything. It was a studio portrait dated October 1901, showing 3 young women seated together. The photographer's mark in the corner read Sullivan Studios, Lower East Side. The women appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s, dressed in simple but clean clothes. Their best outfits, Emma guessed, saved for special occasions. 2 of the women smiled shyly at the camera. The third, seated in the middle, stared directly at the lens with an expression that was harder to read. Not quite smiling, but not sad either. Determined, perhaps. Defiant. Emma almost moved on to the next image when something caught her eye. She reached for the high-resolution scanner she used for detailed examination, carefully placing the photograph under the light. There on the wrist of the girl in the middle. Her sleeve had ridden up slightly, exposing her left wrist. Even in the faded photograph, Emma could see it. A circular mark, darker than the surrounding skin. Not a birthmark or natural discoloration. A scar. Emma increased the magnification on her computer screen. The mark was too regular, too defined to be accidental. It wrapped completely around the wrist in a band about an inch wide. The skin appeared puckered, damaged. She'd seen marks like that before, in her research on slavery and forced labor. Shackle scars. The kind left by metal cuffs worn for extended periods, rubbing skin raw, leaving permanent damage. But this photograph was from 1901. Slavery had been abolished in America nearly 40 years earlier. What could have caused such a mark on a young immigrant woman in New York City? Emma flipped the photograph over. On the back in faded pencil, someone had written, Mary Bridget Catherine, October 15th, 1901. Safe now, safe now. Those 2 words sent a chill down Emma's spine. Safe from what? Emma needed to know more about Sullivan Studios, and why this particular photograph had been taken. Studio portraits in 1901 were expensive, not something most immigrant women could afford on factory wages. Someone must have paid for this photograph, and Emma suspected it wasn't the women themselves. She searched the Historical Society's records for information about photographers working on the Lower East Side in 1901. Sullivan Studios appeared in several city directories between 1895 and 1908, located at 127 Orchard Street in the heart of the immigrant neighborhood. But what made Emma's pulse quicken was finding Sullivan's name in a different context. A list of contributors to the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and another list connected to the International Council of Women, an organization dedicated to protecting vulnerable women and girls. Sullivan wasn't just a commercial photographer. He was an activist. Emma discovered references to Sullivan in several newspaper articles from the early 1900s. One article from 1902 described a court case involving a domestic servant who had been held against her will by her employer. The evidence presented included photographic documentation provided by concerned citizens. Another article from 1903 mentioned Sullivan by name. Local photographer Mr. Patrick Sullivan has dedicated his services to documenting the conditions faced by immigrant women, providing evidence that has proved invaluable in several prosecutions. Emma understood now. The photograph of the 3 women wasn't a casual portrait. It was documentation, evidence. The mark on the girl's wrist had been deliberately captured, proof of what she had endured. Emma returned to the photograph, studying the faces of the 3 women with new understanding. They weren't posing for a keepsake or memento. They were bearing witness. That defiant look in the middle girl's eyes, the one with the scarred wrist, took on new meaning. She was staring into the camera, into history, saying, "This happened to me." See what they did. Remember. Emma spent the rest of the day searching for more photographs by Sullivan Studios. She found dozens, all carefully dated and labeled. Many showed similar subjects. Young immigrant women, often in groups, often with visible injuries or marks. Sullivan had been creating an archive of abuse, and Emma had just found one piece of that archive. Emma reached out to Dr. Michael Torres, a historian at Columbia University, who specialized in immigration and labor exploitation in early 20th century New York. She sent him scans of the photograph and explained what she'd discovered about Sullivan Studios. Torres called her within hours. "You've found something significant," he said, excitement clear in his voice. There's been research about trafficking networks operating in New York during this period, but physical evidence is extremely rare. Most victims were too afraid to come forward, and the traffickers were careful to leave no paper trail. He explained the system that had trapped thousands of young women. Employment agencies in Ireland, Italy, Poland, they recruited girls with promises of good jobs in America. domestic service, factory work, legitimate opportunities. The families often paid for passage, going into debt for the chance to send a daughter to America. Emma listened, her stomach tightening. But when the girls arrived, Torres continued, they were met by men claiming to represent the employment agencies. These men took their documents, passports, letters of introduction, everything. They told the girls they owed money for passage, for room and board, for the placement services. The debts were fabricated, inflated, impossible to repay. The girls were then placed in households as domestic servants, but their situations were far from normal employment. They worked 18, 20 hours a day. They were locked in at night. If they tried to leave, they were told they'd be arrested as illegal immigrants or thieves. Many were physically restrained, literally chained to prevent escape. The mark on the girl's wrist, Emma said. Exactly. Some traffickers kept the girls shackled at night, or during the day when the family was out to prevent them from running away. The abuse was systematic, organized, and protected by a network of corrupt officials who were paid to look the other way. Torres paused, but there were also networks fighting back. Organizations like the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, settlement houses, reform groups, they tried to identify victims, provide safe houses, gather evidence for prosecutions. Sullivan's photography work was likely part of that effort. Emma looked again at the photograph. 3 young women, dressed carefully, sitting for a formal portrait. But this wasn't celebration, it was documentation of survival. The notation on the back suddenly made perfect sense. Safe now. Someone had rescued these women, brought them to Sullivan's studio, documented what had been done to them. Emma needed to identify the women in the photograph. The names written on the back, Mary, Bridget, Catherine, were common Irish names, which would make the search challenging. But she had other clues. The date, the location, and most importantly, the connection to Sullivan Studios and the rescue networks. She started with immigration records. Ellis Island had opened in 1892, and the records from that period were digitized and searchable. She looked for Irish women named Mary, Bridget, or Catherine who had arrived in New York between 1898 and 1901, assuming. They'd been in the city for a while before the photograph was taken. The results were overwhelming, hundreds of matches. She needed to narrow the search. Emma turned to court records. If these women had been rescued from trafficking situations, there might be legal documentation criminal cases against their captors. Testimony given in court, records of their experiences. After 2 days of searching through archives, she found it. A case file from November 1901, just 1 month after the photograph was taken. The case involved the prosecution of a woman named Mrs. Harriet Dalton and her husband Thomas Dalton, charged with involuntary servitude and assault upon a domestic servant. The victim's name, Mary Brennan. Age 19, immigrant from County Cork, Ireland. Emma's heart raced. Brennan, her own surname. It was common enough that it might be coincidence, but still. She found Mary's testimony in the court transcript. I arrived in New York in April 1900. I was met at the dock by a man who said he worked for the New York Domestic Service Agency. He took my papers and brought me to a house in Brooklyn. The Daltons told me I owed them $50 for my passage and placement, plus room and board. I worked for them for 17 months. They locked me in the attic at night. When I tried to leave, Mrs. Dalton had me shackled. The testimony included a medical examination report. Subject exhibits scarring consistent with prolonged restraint. Circular abrasions on left wrist indicate shackling for extended period. Emma had found her. Mary Brennan, the girl in the middle of the photograph with the scarred wrist, had been held as a domestic slave for 17 months before someone helped her escape. Now Emma needed to find out who had rescued her, and what had happened to the other 2 women in the photograph. Emma discovered that Mary Brennan's rescue had been orchestrated by a remarkable woman named Sister Margaret O'Reilly, a Catholic nun who ran a settlement house on the Lower East Side. Sister Margaret's work was documented in the archives of the Sisters of Charity, and Emma traveled to their headquarters in the Bronx to access the records. Sister Margaret's journals from 1901 painted a picture of a woman utterly dedicated to helping immigrant girls. She wrote in clear, direct prose. September 18, 1901. A girl came to the settlement house today, sent by Mrs. Cohen from the garment factory. The girl Mary B. showed signs of severe malnutrition and abuse. She wore long sleeves despite the heat. When I asked to see her arms, she wept. The marks on her wrists tell a story of cruelty I can barely comprehend. Sister Margaret had immediately taken Mary to a safe house run by the settlement network, then contacted Patrick Sullivan to document her injuries. The photograph will serve as evidence, Sister Margaret wrote. Mr. Sullivan has agreed to photograph Mary alongside 2 other girls we've recently rescued, so they might draw strength from one another's company. Emma found references to the other 2 women. Bridget Kelly, age 18, from County Mayo. had been rescued from a similar situation in August 1901. Catherine Murphy, age 20 from Dublin, had escaped her captors in July and made her way to the settlement house. All three had been trafficked through the same network. The New York Domestic Service Agency, a legitimate-sounding name that disguised a criminal operation. The agency recruited young Irish women, arranged their passage to America, then sold them into domestic servitude to wealthy families who wanted cheap, compliant labor. Sister Margaret's journals documented dozens of similar cases. "These girls are enslaved in plain sight," she wrote. "They work in fine homes in respectable neighborhoods. Their captors are respected members of society. The girls have no voice, no rights, no hope of escape unless someone intervenes." The settlement house provided shelter, medical care, and legal support. Sister Margaret connected victims with reformist lawyers willing to prosecute the traffickers. She worked with journalists to expose the trafficking networks, and she collaborated with photographers like Patrick Sullivan to create irrefutable evidence of abuse. Emma found a letter from Sullivan to Sister Margaret, dated October 1901. The photographs of the three girls came out well. "The evidence is clear. I've provided copies to the district attorney's office. May God grant that justice be served." Emma obtained the full court records from Mary Brennan's case against the Daltons. The trial had taken place in December 1901, and the newspaper coverage was extensive. The case had become a public sensation, shining a spotlight on the hidden world of domestic servitude and trafficking. Mary's testimony was powerful and detailed. She described arriving in New York full of hope, expecting to work as a housekeeper and send money home to her family in Ireland. Instead, she'd been taken to the Dalton house in Brooklyn and told she owed an enormous debt. "Mrs. Dalton said I owed $50 for my passage, $20 for the placement fee, and $5 per week for room and board," Mary testified. She said I would earn $3 per week, which meant I'd be working for them for months before my debt was paid. But the debt never decreased. She kept adding charges for broken dishes, for meals, for mistakes I supposedly made. Mary described working from 5 in the morning until midnight, 7 days a week. She cooked, cleaned, did laundry, cared for the Daltons' 3 children. She slept in an unheated attic room, ate leftover scraps, and was forbidden from leaving the house. When I tried to leave after 6 months of this treatment, Mr. Dalton caught me at the door. He beat me severely. After that, Mrs. Dalton began locking me in the attic at night. She said if I tried to escape again, she would have me arrested for theft and sent to prison. The shackling had begun after Mary's second escape attempt. One managed to get out of the house one morning when the family was at church. I walked for hours, trying to find help. But I had no money, no papers, no idea where to go. A policeman stopped me and asked why I wasn't at church with my employers. I was terrified to tell him the truth. He brought me back to the Daltons. After that, Mrs. Dalton had purchased iron shackles from a hardware store. She put them on my wrists every night before locking me in the attic. She said if I tried to escape again, I'd be wearing them all day as well. Mary had endured this treatment for 11 months before finally being rescued. A delivery boy came to the house and saw me through the window, wearing the shackles. He told someone, and that person contacted Sister Margaret. She came to the house with a police officer and a lawyer. They demanded to see me. Mrs. Dalton had to unlock the attic. That's how I was freed. The prosecution's case against the Daltons relied heavily on physical evidence, and Patrick Sullivan's photograph played a crucial role. Emma found the trial transcript where the photograph was entered as evidence. The prosecutor had presented the image to the jury. "Gentlemen, I show you a photograph taken on October 15, 1901, at Sullivan Studios on Orchard Street. The young woman in the center is Mary Brennan, the victim in this case. I direct your attention to her left wrist, where you can clearly see a circular scar evidence of prolonged shackling." The defense attorney had objected, arguing that a photograph couldn't prove how the injury occurred. But the prosecution had called a doctor who had examined Mary immediately after her rescue. "The scarring is consistent with metal restraints worn for an extended period," the doctor testified. "The skin shows deep tissue damage, indicating that the shackles were tight and worn continuously for weeks or months. This type of injury doesn't occur from brief or occasional restraint. It requires prolonged, sustained confinement." The prosecution also presented the shackles themselves, purchased by Sister Margaret from the hardware store where Mrs. Dalton had bought them. The shopkeeper testified that Mrs. Dalton had come into his store in February 1901 asking specifically for restraints strong enough to hold a grown person. "I thought it was an odd request," the shopkeeper admitted. "But Mrs. Dalton said she needed them for a disturbed relative who might harm herself. I sold her the shackles along with a padlock and chain." Emma read through the testimony of Mary's fellow victims, Bridget and Catherine, who had been called as witnesses to establish a pattern. Both described similar experiences: false promises, manufactured debts, forced labor, physical restraint. Bridget Kelly testified that she'd been kept in a basement room, chained to a pipe for 3 months after attempting to escape. "They only let me out to work," she said. "The rest of the time I was locked in that basement, chained like an animal." Catherine Murphy described being burned with hot irons when her work wasn't satisfactory. "My employer said I needed to learn obedience," she testified, showing scars on her arms. She said immigrant girls needed firm discipline, that we should be grateful to have work at all. The testimony was devastating. The photograph of the 3 women sitting together with their visible scars became a symbol of the trial proof that the abuse was real, systematic, and far more widespread than most New Yorkers wanted to believe. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Thomas and Harriet Dalton were convicted of involuntary servitude, assault, and unlawful restraint. They were sentenced to 5 years in prison, a significant sentence for the time. Though many reformers felt it wasn't nearly enough, Emma found newspaper coverage of the verdict. The New York Times headline read, "Domestic slavery case ends in conviction. Immigrant girl's testimony exposes hidden abuse." The article described the trial as a watershed moment in the fight against trafficking and labor exploitation. But the article also noted resistance to the verdict. Several prominent citizens have expressed concern that the conviction will discourage families from hiring domestic servants, the reporter wrote. They argue that the Daltons' methods, while perhaps excessive, reflected legitimate concerns about controlling unruly immigrant workers. Emma was struck by how the traffickers' defenders had framed the issue not as slavery or abuse, but as legitimate labor discipline that had gone too far. The same arguments that had been used to justify slavery before the Civil War were being recycled to excuse the enslavement of immigrant women. But the conviction had an impact. Emma found records of similar prosecutions in the months following the Dalton trial, all citing the case as precedent. The photograph of Mary, Bridget, and Catherine was reproduced in Reform publication, used in fundraising materials, and displayed at conferences on immigrant welfare. Sister Margaret's settlement house received increased funding and support. Patrick Sullivan's documentation work expanded, and other photographers began working with rescue organizations to create evidence of abuse. Emma traced what happened to the 3 women after the trial. Mary Brennan had stayed in New York, working at the settlement house alongside Sister Margaret, helping to rescue other trafficking victims. She'd married in 1905. Emma found the marriage certificate to a man named John Walsh, and they'd had 4 children. Bridget Kelly had returned to Ireland in 1902, unable to overcome the trauma of her experiences. Emma found a letter she'd written to Sister Margaret. "I cannot stay in this country where such things are possible. I dream of the chains every night. I need to go home, even though home means poverty. At least there I am free." Catherine Murphy had remained in New York and become a labor organizer, working to improve conditions for domestic workers and factory employees. She testified before the New York State Legislature in 1905, advocating for laws protecting domestic servants. As Emma continued her research, she discovered that the Daltons were part of a much larger trafficking network. The New York Domestic Service Agency they'd worked with was connected to similar operations in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. She found records from a federal investigation launched in 1902, prompted partly by the Dalton conviction. The investigation revealed a coordinated system. Recruiters in Ireland and Italy who identified vulnerable young women, shipping companies that offered discounted passage in exchange for placing the women with specific employment agencies, and dozens of wealthy families who knowingly participated in the system. The investigation's final report, published in 1904, estimated that between 1895 and 1902, at least 2,000 young women had been trafficked through the New York agency alone. Nationwide, the number was likely in the tens of thousands. These women were commodities, the report stated bluntly. They were bought and sold, their labor extracted through force and intimidation, their freedom stolen. That this occurred in the United States of America, less than 40 years after the abolition of slavery, is a national shame. The report led to new federal legislation, the Act for the Protection of Immigrant Workers, passed in 1905. The law made it illegal to confiscate workers' documents, to charge inflated or fabricated debts, or to restrict workers' freedom of movement. It established penalties for traffickers and created a fund to assist victims. But enforcement was spotty. Emma found case after case where traffickers were prosecuted, convicted, and given minimal sentences. Wealthy families caught employing enslaved servants often paid fines but faced no jail time. The social connections that protected the Daltons' clients protected many others as well. Still, the legislation made a difference. Rescue organizations like Sister Margaret's Settlement House now had legal backing for their work. Women who escaped trafficking situations had more legal protections and more options for seeking justice. Emma found records showing that Patrick Sullivan continued his documentation work until his death in 1918. His archive, dispersed after his death, contained photographs of over 300 women who had survived trafficking, each image a testimony, each face a story of survival. The photograph of Mary, Bridget, and Catherine wasn't unique. It was one piece of a massive documentation project, an attempt to make visible what society wanted to keep hidden. Emma prepared her findings for publication, but she also wanted to do something more personal. She needed to find out what had happened to Mary Brennan Walsh and her descendants. Given that Emma shared Mary's original surname, she wondered if there might be a family connection. She traced Mary's children through census records and genealogical databases. Mary had died in 1956 at age 74, survived by her 4 children and numerous grandchildren. One of her granddaughters, Patricia Walsh, was still living now in her 80s, residing in Queens. Emma called Patricia and explained her research. There was a long silence on the phone, then Patricia said, "I knew there was something." Grandma Mary never talked about her early years in America. She'd talk about her childhood in Ireland, about meeting Grandpa John, about raising her children. But those first few years after she arrived, nothing. We always wondered. Emma visited Patricia the following week, bringing copies of the photograph, the court records, and Sister Margaret's journals. Patricia held the photograph of her grandmother at age 19, tears streaming down her face. "Look at her eyes," Patricia said. "She's terrified but trying to be brave. And that mark on her wrist, I remember seeing a scar there when I was a child. I asked her about it once, and she just said she'd had an accident long ago. She never explained." Patricia shared what she knew of her grandmother's later life. "She was the kindest, strongest woman I ever knew. She volunteered at immigrant services organizations, helped new arrivals find housing and work. She was passionate about workers' rights, women's rights. Now I understand why." Emma showed Patricia the records of Mary's work with Sister Margaret after the trial. "Your grandmother helped rescue dozens of other women. She became an advocate, a voice for people who couldn't speak for themselves. She never told us," Patricia said, wonder in her voice. "She carried this alone her whole life." Why? Emma thought about that. Shame, maybe. Or wanting to protect you from knowing what she'd endured. Or perhaps she just wanted to be defined by who she became, not by what had been done to her. Emma's research was published in the Journal of American History and picked up by national media. The photograph of Mary, Bridget, and Catherine appeared in newspapers and online, accompanied by their stories. The mark on Mary's wrist became a symbol evidence of a hidden history of trafficking and abuse that had affected thousands of immigrant women. Descendants of Bridget Kelly and Catherine Murphy contacted Emma, grateful to finally understand their ancestors' stories. The 3 families connected, bound by the shared history of women who had survived together. The New York Historical Society created a permanent exhibition featuring Sullivan's photographs and the stories of trafficking survivors. The centerpiece was the 1901 portrait of 3 friends, sitting together, their scars visible, their courage preserved forever. Emma stood in the exhibition hall on opening night, watching visitors study the photograph. Many stopped, leaned close, saw the mark on Mary's wrist, and understood. What had looked like an ordinary portrait of friends was actually a testament to survival, resistance, and the power of documentation to expose injustice. Patricia Walsh stood beside Emma, looking at her grandmother's young face. "She was just 19, Patricia said softly. "Trapped, abused, treated as property. But she survived. She fought back. She helped others. That scar on her wrist, it's not just a mark of what was done to her. It's proof that she survived, that she was strong enough to bear witness." Emma nodded. "That's why they took this photograph. Not to remember the trauma, but to document the truth. To make sure that what happened to them would be seen, known, and remembered. So it could never be denied or forgotten." The mark on Mary Brennan's wrist had told its story across 123 years. And now, finally, that story was being heard not as a shameful secret, but as a powerful reminder of courage, survival, and the importance of bearing witness to injustice, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be.